Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this video we're going to look at the rebuild of an engine in 20 minutes.
I think that the patient is dead.
And yes, this is an old known vehicle I have, and the first thing we will do, of course, is to remove the engine from the car. Otherwise it's going to be damn hard to rebuild it. Engines tend to be pretty dirty, so a good wash down is always handy, and a dry up with a air blower. And then we can start the final disassembly. Taking the flywheel off and then do an initial inspection. And these push rods and valves, they look a little bit tacky, so it certainly is a need for a complete rebuild. Removing the carburetor, and quite often these parts are not that easy to remove, and it's not uncommon that bolts break off. It looks like we have not been burning a lot of oil because there is not a lot of carbon buildup. Also, the water pump will have to be removed and reconditioned. And then it was time to drain the oil, and oh my god, what was this? Some sludge, water and oil. Not a good sign, and look on that. Look how dirty that really is. And then it was time to take the cylinder head off and have a check on the cylinders themselves. And the head gasket looked quite alright, and that typically gives you a pretty good indication what is wrong with the engine. But these cylinders, well, these are in a real bad shape. Now, they are not real cylinders as such, they are sleeves, and there we've got a hole even in the piston. So there's not much more to do than take the whole thing apart. So we're taking off the front pulley, taking off the timing cover, and then trying to remove, of course, the camshaft. A little bit by a little bit, and of course I have to pull on both sides at the same time, and this can be a little bit difficult sometimes. Notice the double timing chain. And now comes the moment of truth. Let's see what we have inside the oil pan. The oil filter, well, that's all clogged up. That's what we expected, really. This is the oil pump, and all that has to come up. But look at the sludge inside the oil pan. This is really, really bad. So I'm going to knock out the oil pump and the drive shaft for the distributor, and then slide out the camshaft, which is just held in place with a couple of bolts in the front. And I do like to mark things, so whenever I reassemble everything, I know exactly what comes from where, because that is important on those old engines. Those cylinders, well, or pistons in the cylinders or in the sleeves, they were really stuck inside, so I had to hammer them out. And now the crankshaft can come out. And I'm trying to get these pistons out, and look at the shape of those pistons. Not that easy to get them out, so I needed a bit of force. And I'm also pushing out those sleeves, because I will put no sleeves in. Inside, well, you got your typical rest, but on the bottom, that's where the sleeves are sitting on, and it's very important that that is intact and it can be cleaned up. If not, then you might have to take it to a machine shop and get it cleaned. So now it was time for another big cleanup, now at the inside. And again, I'm engraving the main bearing caps, so I know exactly where everything is, and then cleaning up things. And look on the old bearings, how they are grooved. So we're taking them out because we will replace them with some new ones. The crankshaft is cleaned up and verified, while I'm actually repainting and shot blasting the old engine block. And here you see me checking the camshaft. The camshaft was slightly pitted, and I did polish it, so that little bit of pitting, I don't worry too much about it. So I kept that, and now it was time to remove some of the old seals and flatten most of the surfaces on the engine block after the painting. And I like to use a micrometer for this, or a gauge, and I'm using a piece of glass to smoothen them off, the surfaces, by attaching a very fine abrasive paper to it. And this is how you can get it very clean. And then I'm double checking it again with the meter, making sure everything is clean. I'm cleaning out the holes where the followers are sitting, and I'm putting a little bit of sanding inside, as you can see, to make it all smooth. And then meanwhile, well, guess what? The new inserts arrived. Now you might have seen that the seating of the old sleeves wasn't all that nice. So I'm using an old one actually with grinding paste to clean them up. And here you can see how clean they become by just rotating that old sleeve inside with some grinding compound typically used for valve seats. So now that is all cleaned up, and now I can actually trial fit the inserts or the sleeves. And they have to sit a certain distance from the top. You will need to fit different seals underneath to have that dimension there. But anyway, after that, I took it all back out, and I wanted to make sure that the engine block was absolutely having no blockage whatsoever. So I like to use water pressure to check all the channels for that. And here we are back to the camshaft, and I'm checking the camshaft bearing areas, just making sure that everything is within spec, which is kind of important. And then I could put things back together with some lube, and we all have different approaches of lube by assembling. So now that original camshaft is really back in. And now it was time for the pistons, and as you can see, I've got oversized pistons that are fitting perfectly into the sleeves. I also have new segments on them, and I'm now putting the center pin out because I need to attach the rods to it. And I do like to grease things up each time I assemble something, and I want to have a very clean working space for all this. Now I don't need to use a lot of force on this. Now on some engines you may actually have to heat up that pin to get it inside. I'm tightening up the segments on the cylinder, and then I gently knock the piston into the sleeve. These are the seals or the gaskets that go on the bottom of the sleeve, and they have to be of a certain size, but we already kind of pre-checked this. And again, the pistons have a certain pointer on them, an arrow, and you got to make sure that that's in the right direction. I also numbered the bearings on the bottom for each of the pistons, and now it was time to double check and verify and rebuild the oil pump. You can see the oil pump is basically based on two tooth wheels, which is pushing the oil through. On this side, we've got the regulator for the oil pressure, and I got a new set of tooth wheels. I reassemble everything, and then we're going to take it to a test before I actually put it back into the engine. I was missing a gasket, so you might want to make some gaskets of your own with gasket paper, and you just saw the test I did with the oil pressure, and that was good. We got ample of oil pressure, and now it was time for the cylinder head, which was in a pretty poor state, so even that had to be fully reconditioned. So now it was time to take that apart, remove all the valve springs, get it all cleaned up. Got the rocker shaft and the rockers all off, including all the springs, and the rocker shaft itself, well, I could even feel the wear and tear on it, so we certainly will need a new one for this. You can see the play when I move the rocker around on it. And finally, we checked all the valves, and also we were checking now the main bearing journals after it came back from the grinding shop or the machine shop. We also putting the new main bearings in. Again, those are oversized, and I wanted to make sure they fit properly, as you can see. And we cleaned them all up, and then we put the bearings up completely and double checked it with a gauge. And then it was time to put them all in, making sure that the oil channels all align. And then finally I could put the newly grinded crankshaft back into the engine block, tighten up to torque the main bearings. But that's not the only thing. You also need to check the lateral play on the crankshaft. So I'm pulling it all the way back, and then I'm going to push it forward and see on the dial or the gauge how much play I have. And if I have too much play, I have to put a bigger shim in or a washer. But here, well, that was quite all right. I got it right from the first time, so I was quite happy. So now I can connect the big ends of each of the pistons. Again, we put bearings up, put the bolts in the right direction, in the right position, pre-grease or oil everything, and then put the caps on and tighten them. Again, we tighten the things to torque, making sure everything rotates freely, and of course we will then tighten them finally, and we will lock down all the nuts with this metal lip, and then finally we will put on the counterweights and secure them in place. The timing sprocket, which fits on the crankshaft, was up for replacement, but it didn't have a marker for the top dead center, which you need to align the crankshaft and the camshaft together. So I had to drill a little hole, make a marker, put it all back together, put the cover back on, and then we added the front pulley and installed actually the renovated or renewed oil pump, locked it into place, making sure that everything is well connected, because that's a vital element for your engine. We got the oil filter inside the oil pan all cleaned up, and then we double checked the gasket, the head gasket. I got it in the mail meanwhile, but we'll install it later. But right now it was time to clean up all the rockers and all the other parts that went in the ultrasonic, while I was actually closing up the oil pan. And for that I have this cork seal, but I like to use some silicone on the edges to avoid leaks. And again, we put everything to torque, as always. There's a certain sequence for that. And so far, I have not seen any leaks on that engine, so it's always good practice to do that. I also like to oil in some of those cork seals. And here the pan goes back on, and then we lock it in place. This is a graphite seal that goes around the crankshaft, and it's a little bit hard to get to, but at the end, yeah, that worked out just fine. And I'm just tightening up the bolts. Overall, the rebuild on this engine wasn't all that hard. Now I'm removing some of those washers. That was just to hold the inserts in place. And I'm checking my new gasket. And guess what? The new gasket I got didn't have all the holes that I have on my old one. So I had to create some holes in the new gasket. That sometimes happens. That's why you should always keep the old ones. And here I'm just putting in the followers. I'm having my gasket with the copper side facing down, and my completely renewed cylinder head goes on. So we changed some of the valves, re-grinded the valves, the valve guides, all done, and now I'm just torquing it down. I'm putting the push rods in. Again, those are new push rods. And here is my rocker shaft, brand new, because the old one was worn out. And I'm just checking here with oil pressure to see if all the channels are free. I'm making sure that the holes for all the bolts are free as well. And I'm cleaning all the pedestals and have them numbered. So always number your parts when you take it apart and when you put it back together. It makes it so much easier. You can see there's a lot of little parts involved here, springs and washers. So it's always good to lay them out on a table so you know exactly what goes where. And you want to make sure that all the oil channels are working properly. You don't want to tighten down all the valves to their full position in terms of gaps from the beginning, because it's better to release them all instead of damaging them. So here I'm just spraying oil into the oil channels, and I'm pushing compressed air to it, so I can see the bleeding of oil through all the oil openings on the camshaft. And then it was time for, of course, the carburetor. The carburetor needs a fuel pump, and the fuel pump is using a membrane. I took it apart completely, and the membrane was really worn, so I got a new membrane consisting of multiple layers. We cleaned it all up, installed it, and then we could put it onto the actual engine and test it all out. It's a piece of cake to rebuild this kind of a fuel pump, so you don't need to buy a new one. You can most of the time rebuild those. And here I'm just testing it out, and you can see how it pumps, right? It goes real well. It goes back on the engine block. And here's our intake manifold. Now that had a little bit of a problem. Some of the bolts broke off on the exhaust, so we had to cut them off, drill them out, and then tap new thread inside before we could attach really the exhaust to it or the studs. At the end, this went quite easy. I didn't expect it to be that easy. So here's our engine almost completely built. We're putting the new seals up or gaskets, and here we go. We can now install our cleaned up and corrected intake manifold. We torque it down to the right torque, and now we needed to look at the carb. Now the carb was dirty inside, so it went into the ultrasonic, completely disassembled, and we got it cleaned up, reassembled it, so we could then install it on the car. I also got a spare flywheel, and on this one I cleaned up the teeth on the flywheel, or the ring. What is it called again? The crown wheel or something like this. The centering bearing went in, which is a new bearing, important for the clutch. We torqued it all down, and then we installed the clutch after we had centered it. And that's the red plug you see, where we actually make sure that the clutch plate is in the right position. We reconditioned the water pump. We've been cutting some new gaskets for that because the old ones were gone and I didn't have new ones. And now we could basically install it. I put some paste on it so the gaskets can go on. This was mylar paste. It's not silicone. And then I went back onto the cylinder head, and then we just greased it. So that should be doing a good job now. It's important to grease it. Don't forget to do so. And then we had to work on the distributor. We double checked the bob weights and the springs and the different components that go inside. Do an electrical test, making sure that the breaker points are working, that we have no shorts, that the capacitor is good. And then the new breaking points went in. And here we're checking the breaking points. Nice continuity, a new capacitor to suppress the sparks that you may have on your breaker points. And here I'm just checking out that distributor, rotating it on the bench. And yes, we got sparks, so all that seems to work. Checking top dead center for the first cylinder, and then position the distributor as such that we have the spark at the right position for the right cylinder, so we can cable everything up. Of course, the crankshaft was in the right position. And here's our carb again, now been put together after it went through the ultrasonic. It goes on top of the engine. Checking the oil pressure on the engine, pumping it all up. And we should be ready to go. Putting the choke on.
So, I guess the engine now has all the vital elements it needs. So now this engine should start like a champ. So let's try it out and see how easy it starts or not. I think this is pretty good. You can see that the valves are getting greased pretty well. There's a lot of oil coming out. And
So thank you for viewing, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye bye.